This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast, a podcast with a worldwide listenership that explores the broad world of preservation from every angle, from drones to mudlarking and everything in between. Now, let's get preserving. Join us in exploring a new narrative of the American Revolutionary War from the eyes of hired German soldiers known as Hessians. On this week's PreserveCast, we're talking with Friederike Baer about her book, Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. We'll explore the untold stories of the Hessians and the profound impact they had in the American Revolution. This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast. We're very excited today to be joined by Friederike Baer, who is the Associate Professor of History and the Division Head for Arts and Humanities at Pennsylvania State University's Abington College. She holds a Ph.D. in Early American History from Brown, and today we're going to be talking with her all about her new book, Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War, which is a fascinating topic, one that's near and dear here to me, recording out of Frederick, Maryland, where we have a Hessian barracks. And what does that mean? And how is this story borne out on the landscape even to this day? But we'll dive into all that here today with Friederike. And but first and foremost, I think people are always fascinated to get to know our guests. So where'd you grow up, and what led you to working as a historian and a writer? How did all of this kind of come together?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and talk about the Hessians. I grew up in Germany. I was born near the French border in Germany, but I grew up in West Berlin. It was then West Berlin. And went to America right after high school for a little bit, then went back to Germany and started college at the University of Göttingen. And although I've always liked history, I did not start out as a history major. I was studying English. I wanted to study art. I had very different interests. And then one semester I took a undergraduate seminar in early American history that really basically entailed close readings of what people would consider important primary documents related to early America. Things like the Mayflower Compact or Joseph François Laviteau's records related to Canada and Native Americans in the 18th century. And I really enjoyed that class. I basically just discovered that close reading of historical records, primary records, was really just fun for me to do, but also something that I could envision myself doing, as part of my career after college. So I switched my major to history. And then at some point I transferred to an American college. I went to Boston College and then decided to get a PhD in early American history at Brown University. But it was basically this one class with, looking back, I think a really inspiring and inspired professor who turned me on to early American history.
It's so interesting how these primary source documents can really get people excited. And obviously, we're going to be talking about how you use primary source. And this, I love this dovetail between your German background and the Hessians and being able to kind of use that familiarity, obviously, with the language and an understanding of where they came from, to kind of explore something that happened in American history. I just think that that's really a really cool way of kind of pulling all those different threads of your life together in a way that, first for an American without a real deep understanding of German history would probably, and the German landscape and the German language, would be a very difficult thing to do. And obviously it has been difficult because people have written about it, but not at the level that you have.
Yes.
So for people who are, I'm interested. So early American history, what was your dissertation? What did you kind of explore early? Was it always the Hessians, or was it a different part of American history?
When I think back, when my interest in the Hessians started, it's actually started relatively early on. I actually have a book from my childhood. It is sort of a fictional account of a boy who signs up as a kind of a drummer boy. So I was maybe 12 years old when I got that book. I don't have, honestly, memory of reading it back then, but apparently I was exposed to these stories early on. Now, I come from a part of Germany that did not send soldiers to North America, so it wasn't really part of my education really in Germany generally. I didn't really learn more about it once I came to America. And I wrote an undergraduate thesis actually on what we know as the Convention Army, and specifically the German troops that were captured at Saratoga in 1977 and then spent years as prisoners of war in Massachusetts and then in Virginia. Many, of course, ended up in Frederick, Maryland as well. So as an undergrad, I was interested in it. Then I moved to other topics. My dissertation was on German Americans, the German community in Pennsylvania after the American Revolution. So still related to Germans in America, but really not concerned with the Hessians, not concerned with the Revolutionary War. It was more about their community, the church, education, sort of their key institutions. But I do remember when I was looking at graduate programs and I was talking to professors who I thought I'd work with, that who ended up being my advisor, Gordon Wood. When I first met with him, before I even went to grad school, he said to me, "You speak German, you know German, you should use that. There are so many records related to early American history that are in German." And that kind of always stuck with me. And he was absolutely right. So my dissertation was about something slightly different. My first book was about something different. So it was only after a while of doing different projects that I decided to return to the Hessians.
It's really cool. And I also like that you just dropped on everyone that you studied under like a luminary of American historiography. Just by the way, Gordon Wood. So that's pretty cool. So obviously we're picking up the threads of how you get to the Hessians. When did you make the decision? And then we'll talk about it because not everyone probably knows what they are. Or who they are, but how did you get to, did you stumble across some type of primary source that you're like, I have to pick this apart? How did you kind of make the decision to start writing about them?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I set out, when I thought, I want to return to this, I actually started out with having a fairly narrow focus. What I was interested in is researching and writing about, a woman. Her name is Friederike Baer. She was the wife of the commander of the Braunschweig troops that were in Canada, and then many of them, including her, were captured at Saratoga. She wrote an account. Some of your listeners might know this. She wrote an account after her return to Germany after the war about her experiences that were published in 1800 and that became quite popular in Germany. It's the only known published account by a woman that accompanied the German court to America. And her memoirs have been translated. It's a great translation available. And I was interested in learning more about doing more with this book. And once I set out on this, I discovered basically, there's so much more out there. And there are so many questions that I couldn't find answers to. Like, really, who were these Germans? Why did Britain hire them? How did they get here? What did they think of the American land, the people, the war, Native Americans? Did they write about slavery? I mean, there were all these questions. And ultimately, I discovered there is some good scholarship on different pieces of that, but there really isn't a more comprehensive study that addressed these kind of questions that I had. That's basically when I very quickly decided, this is going to be a bigger book. It's not just going to be about the Braunschweiger troops, not just going to be about this woman or her family. She came here with 3 daughters. It's going to be about the German auxiliary troops collectively.
Well, it's like all good things. It starts with a bunch of questions, right? And so let's take a step back for people listening who maybe aren't familiar with it, or they're from a part of the country where they haven't heard about them, or part of the world where they haven't heard of them. So in the context of the American Revolution, the colonies are rebelling against their British, the colonial overlords. And so what is the context here, and what ends up happening? Who are these Hessians? Kind of paint the picture to kind of explain the context of all of this.
So the Revolutionary War breaks out in spring of 1975. conquered Lexington, Bunker Hill, those early battles. And it's very clear at least to the commanders who are in North America at the time Boston was the British headquarters, that the Britain needed more troops in the colonies if they wanted to put down this rebellion. Some estimated maybe 20,000. So very early on, the king looked around, basically considered how can we send more men to America? For various reasons, he did not think he could raise those troops necessarily in England. He also didn't think there would be enough men that could be raised in other parts of the empire, including maybe loyalists or Irish. So he looked to foreign nations for help. And I want to emphasize this was nothing unusual. Quite a few European powers routinely hired foreign armies to help protect their interests and fight their wars. So the king actually first turned to Russia. Russia turned him down. He then tried to recall what is called a Scots Brigade that was in the Netherlands at the time. That didn't work out. And he then he sent an emissary to the German territories. By that time, this is late 75, some German territories had already offered troops. They had already heard, the king's going to need some soldiers. We've supplied them with troops before. We're going to offer them our parts of our military. The basic transaction was, we offer you troops for whatever purpose. You pay us money. It's a contract. It's
and who actually gets the money? I've always been curious about it. So is it the state, the German, because at this point there's no German unification. So these are many different little states of Germany or principalities. And so it's the person in charge of the baron of that place gets the money. And then in theory, the soldiers get paid as well.
Absolutely. So no, that's important. So the subsidy treaty stipulated that there's a set dollar amount per year, depending on number of troops and so forth, that would be paid by Britain to the territory. And you're absolutely right. So let's say in the case of Braunschweig, the Duke of Braunschweig would get that money. Now, the troops were also paid. And in fact, the soldiers that were recruited were paid at the same level as British troops, which was decent pay for the time. So the soldiers did not do this for free. They were paid wages. And they were also often paid some kind of bounty that helped, of course, in recruiting these men. So they got their individual pay, but the rulers also got subsidy payments. And they used those for personal expenses. That of course, there was a lot of criticism of that. But they also used it for public works projects, paying down debt, building hospitals or schools or villages or bridges or whatever. But it was a transaction, essentially. It was kind of a deal between two rulers to hire out armies.
And what is the scale of it? So is it, in terms of the scale of the Crown's forces engaged, what are we talking about in terms of the numbers of Hessians who actually fought?
That's a great question. So we used the number of 30,000 German troops went to America. I think those estimates go back to basically to the war when contemporaries tried to kind of add up, different shipments and transports. Some historians have argued the number was probably higher. The numbers also don't include women and children, and there were hundreds of them. And it's important to remember that these armies, they include a lot of civilians as well. That number, they came from 6 territories ultimately. The majority came from the 2 territories of Hessen-Kassel and Hessen-Hanau, and that's why we collectively refer to them as Hessians. There were at least 20,000 or so really Hessians. And then there were maybe 1,200 or so from the small territory of Waldeck. So it's a very diverse group of individuals. By 1781 or so, they make up about 1/3 of the British regular army strength in North America. So it's not just, a minor contribution to this war. It's 1/3 of the regular British Army force in North America.
Yeah, I don't I don't think people completely appreciate that. And I think that's one of the really important things about your book. And we'll put a link for everybody who's listening in the show notes to the book. It would make a great holiday present for somebody. Perfect timing for this. And I mean, really, for somebody who's interested in the American Revolution and looking at diving into a different aspect of it that they haven't explored before, sort of eye-opening. And like when you throw that number out, I think some people think, oh yeah, there were some Germans who fought too. And you're talking about a third of the army. And so, spoiler alert for people who don't know, the British do not win the war. But so what impact did they have? Did they keep the British from losing sooner? Did they, if it had been an all Hessian army, would they have won? Was it, what impact? I mean, and this is you kind of, I guess, some subjectivity here, but like, what impact did they have on the war?
Yeah, as you just suggested, I do think that the availability of these foreign troops does prevent the end of the war in its early stages. I think, and other historians have argued too, that it gives Britain a kind of a fighting chance, that they have this supply of troops available. So that's, I think, a major contribution. German troops participated in every major battle. Sometimes there are as many as half the British troops in any given battle or campaign. They participated in many less significant military encounters or skirmishes. So it's hard to tell in each individual case what their contribution was, but it's very clear that they had an impact on the outcome of these individual encounters one way or the other. I would also say that Britain's decision to use them gave American, quote unquote, what we call patriots, an opportunity or gave them an excellent propaganda tool, essentially. Because even before the first Germans set foot on American soil, the Americans were using Britain's use of these mercenaries, hirelings to plunder their homes and destroy their villages, against their own subjects. Britain is using these against their own subjects. They used that as sort of a tool to rile up resistance, to get support for independence in the spring of 76. So it is, in that regard, comes as a welcome, like a propaganda tool. And then in terms of contributions, these Germans, they had created a huge volume of records, private and public, official and personal, some of which was published during the war in German-speaking Europe. So I would also say that these the participation of these Germans in this war, first of all, almost overnight increased interest in the war in Europe, because suddenly this is a remote thing that's happening. We don't even know what the cause is involving all these Germans. So there's more interest. But then these soldiers and civilians, they act almost in some ways like foreign correspondents. They are published, they're sending things home that are meant to be published or circulated. So it increases knowledge of North America generally and the war specifically in German-speaking Europe. So
is that because
it's also contribution?
Yeah, is that because they were more? Do you have a sense that they were more literate than the British line?
Well, that's so. I should, of course, I should probably mention that the vast majority, and I think that's not unique here to this particular military, the vast majority of the written records that we have were created by officers.
Right.
We do have some. We have a handful of diaries and letters that are written by privates. They tend to be rare. So when we are talking about impressions of America by these Germans, the bulk of the records that we have to shed light on this are written by officers.
Well, why don't we take a quick break, come back, talk about the impact that they left on the country and that we even still feel to this day, and then talk about the process of writing this and maybe any surprises that came along the way. And we'll do that right here on PreserveCast. Historic preservation can't happen without skilled tradespeople to perform the work, and there's a critical need right now for those tradespeople. The Campaign for Historic Trades, powered by Preservation Maryland, is working to meet that need by strengthening apprenticeship opportunities within historic trades. In partnership with the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Training Center and Conservation Legacy, the campaign is currently recruiting for NPS Traditional Trades Apprenticeship Program, or TTAP. TTAP's an intensive 20-week apprenticeship that provides young adults the chance to learn historic trade skills while working on America's most iconic historic sites. Multiple positions are open for the 2022 season at national parks across the country. Visit historictrades.org for more information on TTAP and how to apply today. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. We are thrilled to be joined today by Friederike Baer, who, again, is the Associate Professor of History and the Division Head for Arts and Humanities at the Pennsylvania State University at Abington College. We're talking all about her book, Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War, and really kind of getting a deep dive into this somewhat, not untold, but perhaps misunderstood aspect of the American Revolution. And as America begins to think about the 250th anniversary, important to think about all these diverse stories that come out of the Revolution. So, we talked about the impact that they had. A third of the British Army at some points, engaged in almost every major battle, engaging, a European audience in the story of what's happening here in the colonies. So we know about the impact that they had, but I always find it fascinating the impact that they had sort of after the war. So not all of them go back. Some figure out a way to stay. And I know that there has been research here in Frederick, Maryland about the descendants of Hessians, because we still have quite a few of those. What happens to them after the war? I mean, obviously, for a group so big, there's going to be as many stories as there are people. But on a large scale, what are the trends that we see in terms of these Hessians after the war?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there are communities and organizations out today that are dedicated to researching the Hessian ancestry and what happened and so forth. So it's a fascinating topic. My book doesn't really go much into that. I think that would have been volume 2 of my book, which is already a big book. But I do want to mention, so one thing that I hear when people talk to me like, oh yeah, the Hessians didn't, like many of them, immediately desert and stay in America. It wasn't quite like that. To give some quick numbers, let's say we started with 30,000 troops, an estimated 23,000 survived the war. The ones that died, the vast majority died of disease or of accidents, which is very typical for 18th century armies. We think that maybe 1,200 or so actually died in battle. So we have maybe 5,000 or 6,000. So of those 23,000, the vast majority went back to Germany. 17,000, they sailed back over the course of the war or during evacuation in 83. And by the way, they take with them some Americans, including at least 200 Black men, women, and children who took the opportunity to go to Europe instead of staying in America. We have about maybe 5,000 or 6,000 that remain in America. Maybe half of them actually go to Canada. Britain offered land grants to German soldiers who wanted to settle in places like Quebec and Nova Scotia and other provinces. And about half of these survivors that decided to stay took up this opportunity. Maybe 2,500, 3,000 did settle in what is then the United States, of course. It looks like from the records that we have, much of it anecdotal. People, for obvious reasons, tended to kind of disappear into their communities. It looks like they tended to settle in areas that were heavily German American, and sometimes it's the same, basically, where they had been imprisoned for extended periods of time. Frederick, Maryland is one example, but also Lancaster, Pennsylvania, for example. We have soldiers that spent, in some cases, years in captivity in these areas, for German prisoner of war, captivity often meant they got to hire themselves out. They worked on local farms. They got to meet locals. Maybe they met a woman. Maybe they got married. In other words, they really started feeling at home after a while.
Well,
so
and there's also, it sort of checks, both of those places check both boxes that you said, imprisoned for a long time and local Germanic population.
Exactly.
So Lancaster and Frederick both check both of those boxes.
Exactly. And there is some speculation that when the Americans decided where to establish these large prisoner of war camps, they chose these regions for that reason. In other words, they were hoping that local German Americans might potentially entice these prisoners to desert. So that's not a coincidence that these locations were selected. So yeah, I think they, got there. Maybe these people learned some English while they were there, although they could probably get around with German. And they were more likely, especially in 1783, when they were recalled to New York in preparation for evacuation. We know that several hundred of them never made it back. They decided, you know what, I'm gonna stick around. I'm gonna stay here. This is an opportunity for me for a new life, a new start.
So in the process of writing this, I would imagine most of the materials you're using are, at least the German materials, you had to translate yourself. Talk to us about the German language that you were translating. Is it a German that you were familiar with, or is it a different type of German?
Well, the language is a language I'm familiar with. The script is something that hasn't been used in about a century or so in Germany. So I think that is one challenge for people who would like to research this. So knowing German, of course, is a great advantage. But if you want to use primary sources, manuscript records, you also have to be able to read the script. And that script looks very different from a modern script that you are using in English and we're using in German today. So the script is a little bit of a barrier. So, but once you master that, the language itself, I mean, it's 18th century, of course. It's not exactly like today, but it is the German we know today. And it's not that difficult to understand once you can decipher the script. So
where does the research take you? I mean, did you have to go back to, not that it's tough duty for a native German to go back to Germany, but did you have to go back to Germany to do most of the research? So most of it's held in repositories there.
Oh, yeah. So, there, like I already suggested early on, there's really, I did not know this when I started out this project, how much material there is and how much material there is that has never been translated, not been published, and also probably not really been looked at by researchers. It's a huge volume. A lot of it is German and created by German officials and soldiers and members of the corps and other people that are involved somehow in all of this. But there's also French records. There's British, obviously, and American records. So it's a huge amount of stuff. I was mostly interested in the German perspective. How did the Germans write about it, the war and all of that? So the bulk of the records that I found especially helpful is in Hessian State Archives, for example, university archives, and then in regional archives in Braunschweig, in Anhalt, Zerbst, in different manuscript collections, also in Prussian archives, because some of the officials deposited their papers there. The Library of Congress in America also have records. The Clements Library at the University of Michigan has a large collection, a famous collection of private material, letters written to an official in Europe. So there is great stuff in America, but I spent many, many weeks in archives in Germany as well.
And biggest surprise, was there any big surprises that came out of the research, things that you just really didn't expect to find, or an aspect of the story that really kind of, I don't know, shock is a too strong a word, but things that you just really didn't expect to find?
Well, I think for me it was full of surprises, but I want two things I want to very quickly. One is that from the beginning of their stay in North America, all of the German regiments actively recruited Black men in particular as drummers, especially as musicians. And really looking back now, it's not really that surprising because having Black musicians in the military is something that was considered to be prestigious in European armies at the time. So for these German regiments, once they're in America, I think they realized pretty quickly that it's an opportunity to recruit Black men in particular to fill these roles as drummers. We dress them up really nicely with feathers. So what Europeans would consider to be exotic outfits, and that lent prestige to units. So that's something I did not expect, but I found a lot of evidence for that. The other surprise maybe is a little strong, but the other story that I have a whole chapter on this is the role of the Germans in West Florida. When most, from my perspective, most books on the Revolutionary War, or many books end with Yorktown, essentially, right? 1781, the last big battle, war is basically over. And I had to really remind myself when I was writing this book and doing this research that the war is not over for the people that are in it. you know, I mean, they're still prisoners of war. They're still occupying Charleston. They're still occupying Savannah. They're in Canada. They're in New York. There's still minor military encounters. And they are also, involved in West Florida. So we have one whole regiment that essentially that is sent to West Florida, to Pensacola, and fights in the Revolutionary War, except for their fight against the Spanish. And that is an experience or something that I didn't really know, honestly, when I set out on this project.
Yeah, I don't think most people kind of connect those dots between the revolution in Florida and that sort of thing. Well, it's fascinating to sit down and talk with you, and would love to have you come to Frederick and take a look at the Hessian barracks here. So what's next? What are you working on now?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of material that didn't make it into the book. So I'm kind of going through this now, kind of trying to think of this particular topic or theme or, that I can use to spin into something bigger. So that's one focus, but I have a lot of different interests. I might also revisit a topic that I worked on before this book project, and that is a murder trial that took place in Pennsylvania after the Civil War. I published on this already. So very different. I might just venture into the late 19th century for a little bit. I have a lot of ideas trying to figure out.
Back to the future for a little bit. So before we go, we love to ask people, it's a challenging question for people who love history. Do you have a favorite historic place or site?
Oh, yeah, that is very challenging. Any place, any place where you can really imagine, that allows you to imagine what it was like for someone to walk down those halls or into that room or down this path is fascinating to me.
So we'll give you an out here. What was your favorite historic place you've most recently visited?
Oh, well, okay. So my most recent historic place was actually Saratoga, the national park in Saratoga, which was amazing. And it's just fields basically. But I walked through them and they did a wonderful job doing like sort of an audio tour. So you can really imagine this is where this line was and this line was. So that was a great experience. If you haven't been to Saratoga National Park, the battlefield, it's worth a visit. I am actually this weekend going for the first time to Yorktown. I'm going to a conference down there and I'm hoping to visit Yorktown. So I would expect this also to be a great experience.
Fantastic. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you here today and talk with you about this, particularly as we sort of gear up over the next several years towards America 250 and start thinking about different stories that need to be told and elevated and the diversity of experiences of the American Revolution. And I think your book definitely sets a standard on that. So we'll put links in the show notes for people to pick that up. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to PreserveCast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland. It's sponsored by the 1772 Foundation and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.